In 1943, ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean were filled with more than just military equipment and essential supplies. They also transported thousands of captured enemy combatants, men who had fought in the deserts of North Africa and across the battlefields of southern Europe. These German military personnel, veterans of campaigns in Tunisia and Sicily and the Italian peninsula, were being sent to detention facilities on American territory. As they prepared to set foot on United States soil, these soldiers anticipated the worst. Everything they had been told by their government's information machine suggested they would face cruel treatment, forced labor in terrible conditions, and perhaps chains binding their wrists and ankles. What actually happened when they arrived caught them completely off guard. The American military, while maintaining strict order and discipline, followed the international agreements that governed the treatment of prisoners during wartime. Among the most startling aspects of their captivity was something they never could have predicted: supervised visits to nearby communities where they walked freely, accompanied by guards, but never shackled. This single detail, the complete absence of physical restraints, made such an impression that years later, when these men wrote their memoirs or gave interviews about their experiences, they mentioned it again and again. Their astonishment began the moment they stepped off the trains that had carried them from harbours on the east coast deep into the interior of the country. The detention facilities where they would spend the war years were scattered across the American heartland in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Iowa. These camps were not simply fenced enclosures designed to confine prisoners. They functioned more like small towns, with infrastructure and organization that went far beyond basic containment. The American soldiers assigned to guard them, many of them young men not much different from the prisoners themselves, established a system that balanced firm authority with basic human courtesy. When groups of captives were formed to leave the camp for work assignments or escorted excursions, there was never the sound of metal chains or the sight of iron restraints. Instead, the men walked in organized formations, monitored but not bound. For soldiers who had grown accustomed to the rigid military culture of the German armed forces and who had witnessed or heard about the brutal way prisoners were treated in European facilities, this lack of physical constraint was deeply confusing. The American towns that received these escorted groups were typically small rural communities facing serious problems with their workforce. With millions of American men serving in the military overseas, farms and local businesses were desperate for workers. Local government officials, working together with the War Department, agreed to use German prisoners as laborers. The system required that armed guards accompany the work details, but even here the contrast with what the prisoners expected was dramatic. A small number of soldiers with rifles might supervise dozens of German captives who were permitted to move freely between farm buildings, across fields, or even down the main commercial street of a town. Former prisoners later described moments when they found themselves standing in front of shop windows, listening to radio broadcasts coming from inside a diner, or catching the smell of fresh coffee drifting out from a local cafe. For men who had been fighting against America just months earlier, the experience felt surreal. One of the most memorable aspects of these town visits, according to prisoner recollections, was the behavior of American civilians. The townspeople did not spit at them or shout abuse. Instead, most treated the German soldiers with a kind of cautious curiosity. Children would sometimes point when they saw the foreign uniforms. Farmers, grateful for the help during harvest season, often acknowledged the prisoners with simple gestures of appreciation. The towns themselves showed no signs of war damage. Unlike the bombed cities back in Germany, these American communities had intact streets, stores with goods on the shelves, and an atmosphere of everyday prosperity that seemed impossible given the global conflict. For the German soldiers, seeing this firsthand contradicted everything they had been taught. They had been told America was a chaotic, failing society, yet here was evidence of abundance, functioning order, and normal life continuing despite the war. The symbolism of walking without chains carried tremendous weight. It suggested that the Americans trusted their system enough that they did not need to publicly humiliate their captives with shackles. The United States Army seemed to understand that discipline and morale could be maintained without degrading the prisoners. One former soldier remembered years later that not being chained made him feel like he was being treated as a human being rather than as livestock. That distinction, though subtle, became something many of these men carried with them long after the war ended. The journey that brought these German soldiers to America often began many months earlier in captured positions in North Africa or at ports in Italy. When the Afrika Korps surrendered in May of 1943, close to 150,000 Axis soldiers became prisoners. Rather than overcrowd British facilities that were already stretched thin, tens of thousands were shipped across the Atlantic. The ocean crossings were lengthy and dangerous, with submarines still active in those waters, but Allied planners decided it was safer to hold German captives far from any potential European battlefield. By the middle years of the war, the United States was housing nearly 400,000 German prisoners spread across facilities in more than 40 different states. When the soldiers reached processing centers on the East Coast, places like Camp Shanks in New York or Fort Dix in New Jersey, they went through extensive intake procedures. They were fingerprinted, photographed, given standard uniforms clearly marked with the letters PW in large black print, and examined by medical personnel. The Geneva Convention from 1929 laid out specific requirements for how prisoners should be treated, and the American military followed these guidelines carefully, determined to demonstrate compliance with international law. The food rations the prisoners received matched what American troops ate, and they were provided with basic necessities like soap, towels, and bedding. For men who had braced themselves for harsh conditions, this treatment was disorienting. Following the processing phase, the captives boarded long-distance trains that transported them to the interior of the country. Facilities in Texas, such as Camp Hearn and Camp Swift, became major centers for holding prisoners. Nebraska's Camp Atlanta and the Algona facility in Iowa eventually housed thousands more. These installations resembled small municipalities surrounded by fencing but not excessively fortified. Rows of wooden barracks lined the grounds, along with dining halls, canteens where prisoners could purchase small items, and even religious chapels. The prisoners quickly discovered that discipline was enforced through organized structure and careful oversight rather than through physical punishment or degradation. American officers made it clear that as long as the prisoners followed the rules, they could expect to be treated with basic dignity. It was during this early period that the foundation was laid for allowing prisoners to leave the camps on supervised work details to nearby towns. The War Department's Office of the Provost Marshal General coordinated with local agricultural organizations and municipal governments to establish a formal system. Communities could request prisoner labor through official channels. The government paid the prisoners a small amount in vouchers they could use at camp stores, while the farmers or employers paid fees to the United States Treasury. From the very beginning, guards accompanied these work groups, but the sight of German soldiers being transported to job sites without handcuffs or leg irons became increasingly routine. The processing phase also included orientation sessions where prisoners were informed of the rules. They were told that attempting to escape would result in punishment, but that good behavior would earn them privileges, including access to reading materials, educational programs, and for many, the opportunity to work outside the camp boundaries. Captives who had specialized skills, such as mechanics, carpenters, or cooks, were often assigned positions within the camp itself, while those with general labor abilities formed the core of agricultural work crews. For the German soldiers, the realization that they might actually be permitted to walk into surrounding towns, even under supervision, seemed impossible to believe. The idea of moving freely through a foreign country during wartime contradicted everything they had been taught to expect, yet the American system was deliberately structured this way to maintain both morale and productivity. There was also an intelligence component to the processing. Certain facilities, such as Fort Hunt in Virginia, which operated under the designation Post Office Box 1142, conducted interrogations of selected prisoners to gather information about German military technology and the state of enemy morale. But even at these specialized sites, despite their secretive nature, the treatment of prisoners remained within legal boundaries. The vast majority of captives, once they had been cleared through initial processing, were sent to standard detention camps where daily life quickly fell into a predictable routine. Wake-up calls at dawn, roll counts, meals served at regular times, and then transport to assigned work locations. The transition from being a captured soldier to becoming a camp resident created an unusual psychological state for many of the men. They were still processing the shock of military defeat in North Africa or Sicily, and now, instead of facing the hostile treatment they expected, they encountered a system that was firm but surprisingly humane. By the time the first work assignments were organized, with trucks and buses carrying them into neighboring communities, many of the prisoners had already begun to understand that their captivity in the United States would be fundamentally different from anything they had imagined. The absence of chains during these transfers symbolized not just American confidence in their security measures, but also reflected a belief that control could be maintained through organization and cooperation rather than constant application of force. For most German soldiers, the first time they walked beyond the camp perimeter was an experience they never forgot. They were not marching in chains or surrounded by heavily armed guards as they had anticipated. Instead, they found themselves walking along quiet American streets, watched by only a small number of uniformed escorts. These initial encounters with American towns revealed a reality that was dramatically different from what Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect. The soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that the United States was a country plagued by disorder, crime, and severe racial tensions. What they actually witnessed were clean sidewalks, active commercial districts, and civilians who seemed more curious about them than hostile. In states across the Midwest, like Iowa, Minnesota, and Kansas, prisoners taken into local towns saw communities that appeared completely untouched by the war that was devastating Europe. The German captives noticed immediately that not a single structure showed damage from bombing, not one bridge had been destroyed, not one street had been torn up by artillery. Small-town America in the 1940s projected an image of stability. Diners were full of local residents drinking coffee and talking. Movie theaters displayed posters advertising the newest Hollywood films. Grocery stores had shelves stocked with products that had become unimaginable luxuries back in Germany. Even though rationing was in effect in the United States, the sheer abundance impressed the prisoners. They saw butter, fresh meat, canned fruits, and cigarettes available in quantities they had not encountered since before the war began. Some of the guards would allow the groups to pause briefly outside shops or to observe local advertising posted on walls and windows, giving the prisoners fleeting glimpses into civilian life in a functioning, prosperous society. The reaction from townspeople varied considerably. Many Americans looked at the Germans with suspicion, remembering Pearl Harbor, reading newspaper accounts of battlefield atrocities, and thinking about ongoing combat where their own sons and brothers were fighting against these very men. Yet other townspeople treated the situation with a kind of practical acceptance. Farmers understood that these prisoners were essential for bringing in the harvest. Local business owners knew that the War Department was providing prisoner labor to help keep production steady during the labor shortage. Children, more open in their curiosity than adults, sometimes waved at the prisoners or attempted to speak to them in broken German. For the German soldiers, it was astonishing that they were not met with violence or hatred. Instead, the general atmosphere was one of controlled civility, a stark contrast to what had been drilled into them about barbaric America under the leadership back home. Personal accounts from former prisoners reveal the specific details that made the strongest impression during these first town visits. The captives remarked on seeing automobiles parked along the streets, Fords and Chevrolets and Studebakers still operating smoothly despite the wartime shift in production priorities. Others remembered hearing popular American music drifting from open windows, artists like Bing Crosby or the Glenn Miller Orchestra, sounds that connected them to a world completely removed from military marches and state-approved anthems. In one written recollection, A former prisoner described his shock at seeing couples walking hand in hand down the street, showing no concern about air raid sirens or nighttime curfews. For him, this absence of visible fear represented the greatest contrast with life in Germany, where even civilian existence was overshadowed by constant reminders of the war. The guards who accompanied these work details often behaved less like enforcers and more like supervisors. Though they carried rifles, their restraint and professional demeanour stood out. A dozen guards might oversee scores of prisoners, relying on discipline and the reality of being thousands of miles from home to prevent escape attempts. The German soldiers quickly realised they had virtually no chance of successfully fleeing across such vast distances, surrounded by an ocean on both sides of the continent. It was this calculated trust, or perhaps confidence in the system, that the prisoners reflected on in later years when describing the American approach to managing captives. For local residents, seeing German military uniforms walking through their own neighbourhoods without chains was a striking sight. Newspaper editorials occasionally raised concerns, questioning why enemy combatants were being permitted such apparent freedom of movement. But military officials consistently reassured communities that security was being maintained effectively. Over time, these supervised visits became routine, though the sense of astonishment never completely disappeared for the men who participated in them. That first step onto American streets, unchained yet still very much prisoners of war, remained a powerful symbol of the strange paradox they were experiencing. They were confined, yet being given glimpses of liberty that were more generous than many of them had known under their own government. As the war continued and American farms faced increasingly severe labour shortages, German prisoners became an essential component of the domestic workforce. By late 1943 and throughout 1944, the War Manpower Commission authorised extensive use of prisoner labour across dozens of states. What continued to astonish the German soldiers was not just the amount of work they were assigned, but the relative freedom they experienced while moving through American communities to perform that work. Their contributions extended well beyond simple maintenance tasks within the camps. They became genuinely important to United States agricultural and industrial output during the war years. The agricultural sector absorbed the largest portion of German labour. In states throughout the country, including Texas, Colorado, and Nebraska, prisoners were transported daily by bus or on foot to fields of cotton, corn, sugar beets, and wheat. The harvest seasons would have suffered catastrophic failures without this workforce, as local men were serving in the military overseas and mechanization alone could not meet the demand. German soldiers worked long hours in these fields, often supervised by just one or two armed guards, and still no physical restraints were used. Farmers who employed these work crews later recalled that the prisoners were generally polite and worked diligently, perhaps motivated by the prospect of better food rations or simply grateful to have meaningful work outside the monotony of camp life. For the Germans, this represented a peculiar form of imprisonment, one where they could freely handle farm equipment and walk across acres of open land, all under the watchful but surprisingly relaxed supervision of their American escorts. Industrial work also became part of the prisoner experience. In various states, captives were contracted to work in lumber mills, food processing plants, and even small factories that produced non-military goods. The Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited using prisoners for direct armament production, but the labour they provided indirectly supported the war effort by keeping essential industries functioning. In Wisconsin, German prisoners worked in paper mills. In Michigan, they were sent to logging operations deep in remote forests. Once again, the absence of physical restraints amazed them. They were handed saws, axes, and operated heavy machinery, yet the Americans seemed to trust that order would be maintained through the system itself. Escape attempts were indeed rare, partly because prisoners understood the futility of trying to navigate vast, rural landscapes with no knowledge of the country, but also because the system had established a kind of mutual understanding between captors and captives. The financial arrangements that governed this labour system reinforced the unusual equilibrium. Prisoners did not receive direct wages, but they were credited with small amounts that could be spent at canteen facilities inside the camps to purchase items like toiletries, writing materials, or small luxuries such as cigarettes and candy. Meanwhile, farmers and local contractors paid the United States government a fixed daily rate for each prisoner worker. This system meant that German soldiers, technically enemy combatants, were generating economic value for the country they had fought against. For men who were familiar with the brutal forced labour practices common in Europe, this arrangement seemed almost incomprehensible. These work assignments became one of the most memorable aspects of captivity for many prisoners. Oral history interviews conducted years later describe their amazement at seeing agricultural fields that stretched endlessly across the Midwest plains, or at participating in harvest operations on a scale that dwarfed anything they had experienced in Germany. For men who had grown up working small family farms, the mechanized scale of American agriculture was both intimidating and impressive. One former prisoner later described his disbelief at seeing a single combine harvester, comparing it to a machine the size of a small house. The economic contribution of German prisoner labor left a lasting impact on the communities that utilized it. Many farmers later acknowledged that without access to this workforce, they would have lost entire crops during critical wartime production years. Local newspapers sometimes reported on the productivity of these labor groups, noting the irony that enemy soldiers were actively helping to feed America during the conflict. For the prisoners themselves, however, the deeper irony lay in how they were treated. They were enemies of the state, yet entrusted with freedom of movement and access to valuable tools and equipment. This paradox reinforced their growing sense that the United States was a society built on pragmatism and confidence, maintaining order through efficiency and systematic organization rather than through brutal repression. Beyond the work assignments and daily routines, German prisoners found themselves exposed to aspects of American culture that they never expected to encounter while in captivity. When escorted groups left the camps for labor or occasional errands, they inevitably absorbed elements of local traditions, entertainment, and everyday habits. Over time, this cultural exposure became as influential as the physical freedoms they experienced, fundamentally reshaping how they perceived the country and its people. Music played a particularly significant role in this cultural education. American popular culture in the 1940s was dominated by swing music and jazz, and these sounds filtered into the camps through radios or during visits to town. The big bands led by Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Duke Ellington were household names for Americans, but represented something exotic and forbidden to Germans who had grown up with martial marches and state-approved folk music. Many prisoners were fascinated to hear such lively, improvisational rhythms while walking past cafes or encountering jukeboxes in small-town diners. The very fact that such energetic, free-form music was part of everyday civilian life stood in sharp contrast to the rigid, controlled culture they had known under the regime back home. Sports provided another window into American life. In states like Iowa and Texas, prisoners saw advertising posters for baseball games, and sometimes organized matches were held within the camps using donated equipment. Guards occasionally arranged informal games between American units and German prisoners, events that were documented in camp newsletters and local papers. For the Germans, baseball seemed completely alien at first, with its unfamiliar rules and specialized terminology, but it represented something important, the idea of leisure and recreation continuing even during wartime. Watching Americans passionately engaged in a sport that served no military purpose emphasized to the prisoners the cultural depth and normalcy of life in their host country. Educational opportunities also emerged as part of this cultural exchange. Many camps offered English language classes, with textbooks provided by organizations like the YMCA or donated by local schools. When prisoners were escorted to town libraries or permitted to receive books through the mail, they encountered literature ranging from American history to contemporary novels. A number of German officers encouraged their men to take advantage of these resources, hoping to maintain discipline and morale through structured study. Some prisoners returned home after the war with fluent English, a skill acquired entirely during their captivity. This intellectual freedom, combined with escorted access to educational facilities, underscored the contrast with the authoritarian restrictions on information and learning they had experienced under their own government. Religious observance was also respected in ways that surprised many prisoners. Catholic priests and Protestant ministers from nearby communities were permitted to visit the camps, and sometimes prisoners being escorted to town could attend religious services under guard. The opportunity to worship openly in churches alongside American civilians was an unexpected dimension of their cultural exposure. The respect shown for religious practice, even for enemy soldiers, impressed many Germans who had witnessed increasing state interference in religious matters during the years of authoritarian rule back home. Daily civilian interactions, though limited and carefully supervised, left profound impressions. Prisoners walking through towns were occasionally approached by curious residents who attempted conversations in broken German or simple English, or who offered small gestures like fruit or newspapers. In some cases, shopkeepers quietly sold items to supervised prisoners, while others maintained a cautious but not hostile distance. These fleeting moments demonstrated to the German soldiers that American society was not uniformly antagonistic toward them, despite the intense conflict raging overseas. Perhaps the most powerful form of cultural exposure was simply witnessing the normalcy of American life continuing uninterrupted. Watching families gather for Sunday church services, seeing children walk to school without fear of bombing raids, or observing couples shopping in stores that had fully stocked shelves. All of this conveyed a vision of stability and prosperity that seemed impossible for a nation actively engaged in a global war. The cultural education happened largely through observation. It presented a model of democratic society at war, but not consumed by it, functioning and even thriving despite the enormous military commitment. For German soldiers who had spent years under authoritarian rule, subjected to constant propaganda about the weakness and chaos of democratic nations, these supervised glimpses into everyday American life offered a startling alternative to everything they had been taught. The presence of German prisoners moving through American towns inevitably generated strong reactions from the civilian population. For many citizens, seeing men wearing foreign military uniforms, men who just months earlier had been fighting American soldiers on battlefields overseas, created deep unease. Yet despite this initial shock, communities gradually adapted to the situation, and their responses over time reflected both the anxieties and the practical necessities of wartime America. Newspaper coverage from that period often reveals the conflicted emotions people felt. Local editorials in Midwestern states expressed surprise and sometimes alarm that enemy combatants were being permitted to move about with relatively light supervision. Some residents openly questioned whether the policy was too lenient, particularly when daily news reports carried stories of American casualties. However, government officials consistently reminded the public that the prisoners were unarmed, vastly outnumbered, and constrained by the sheer impossibility of escaping across thousands of miles of American territory. The War Department emphasized that utilizing prisoner labor was absolutely essential for maintaining agricultural and industrial production, and repeatedly reassured communities that security measures were effective and comprehensive. Civilians who had direct encounters with the prisoners often responded with curiosity rather than outright hostility. Farmers who worked alongside German laborers in their fields generally reported that the men were polite and hard-working. In oral history interviews conducted years later, some farmers recalled offering the prisoners extra food or coffee during work breaks, gestures that reflected both basic human compassion and recognition of the valuable contribution the workers were making. Town residents who saw groups of prisoners passing through their streets sometimes whispered among themselves and observed from a distance, but rarely engaged in open confrontation. Instead, most Americans seemed to watch quietly, their natural suspicion tempered by the recognition that these men were already defeated enemies who were being held securely. There were certainly moments when emotions flared more intensely. Families who had lost sons in North Africa, Italy, or on other battlefields could not easily separate their personal grief from the sight of former enemies walking down their hometown streets. Some communities organised public protests, writing letters to local authorities demanding stricter security measures and more visible controls on prisoner movements. In isolated cases, individuals shouted insults or made it known they refused to do business with farmers who employed German labourers. These tensions highlight the delicate balancing act the government had to maintain, reassuring an anxious public about security while simultaneously using prisoner labour to keep essential industries operating. Interestingly, children often played a unique role in softening these community tensions. Many accounts describe youngsters waving at the prisoners, attempting to practice German phrases they had learned in school, or simply following the groups out of innocent curiosity. Some former prisoners remembered years later how American children laughed and asked questions, small gestures that made the strange experience of captivity feel slightly less alien. For civilian parents, watching their children interact with the prisoners without fear seemed to reinforce the perception that these men, though they had once been dangerous opponents, no longer represented a genuine threat. Religious and civic organisations also became involved in bridging the divide between communities and prisoners. The YMCA and local church groups occasionally organised events that included supervised German prisoners, such as musical concerts or educational presentations. Though controversial in some communities, these activities reflected a broader American commitment to humanitarian principles even during wartime. Reports from towns like Algona in Iowa describe Christmas pageants where prisoners and civilians participated together, creating the remarkable spectacle of former enemies sharing holiday traditions under the watchful eyes of armed guards. At the same time, some African American communities observed the irony that German prisoners were sometimes treated with more visible dignity and freedom than Black American citizens who faced segregation and discrimination in their own country. This paradox did not go unnoticed by contemporary observers, and while not directly connected to the prisoner town visits, it highlighted the complicated and often contradictory layers of American social life during the war years. Overall, civilian reactions to the German prisoner presence ranged across a wide spectrum, from cautious acceptance to outright resentment, shaped by personal experiences with loss, local economic needs, and individual temperament. What remained remarkably consistent was the fact that communities tolerated, and in many cases actively relied upon, the presence of enemy soldiers moving without chains through their streets and working in their fields. This was an extraordinary circumstance by any measure, one that left lasting impressions on both the American civilians who witnessed it and the German prisoners who experienced it. For the German prisoners, one of their few meaningful connections to home came through the letters they were permitted to send. Under the provisions of international agreements governing prisoner treatment, each captured soldier could write several times each month, though every word was reviewed and censored by United States officials before being forwarded overseas. These letters, many of which have been preserved in archives and private family collections, provide rare first-hand testimony about what it felt like to walk through American towns without chains. They also reveal how the prisoners themselves tried to make sense of the reality surrounding them in relation to the image of America they had previously held. Many of these preserved letters describe a sense of disbelief at encountering such abundance and social order. A soldier who had been captured with the Afrika Korps wrote to his family in Bavaria, describing how they were taken outside the camp without chains, only with guards watching them, and that the local people looked at them but did not cause them harm. Another letter mentioned seeing shops with meat, bread, fresh fruit and tobacco displayed in quantities that by that point had nearly vanished from German cities suffering under Allied blockades and continuous bombing. The mere sight of well-stocked store windows became a recurring theme in prisoner correspondence, and the men used carefully chosen words to describe how dramatically different this was from the severe shortages their families were experiencing back home. Prisoners often drew comparisons between their own treatment and the way captives were handled in European facilities. Several men recalled that French and Soviet prisoners in German-run camps had been subjected to forced labour under genuinely brutal conditions. In contrast, the Americans not only paid them a small stipend, but also permitted these supervised excursions beyond the camp boundaries. One former soldier noted in a letter from 1944 that they were treated more like contract workers than like prisoners of war. The censors evidently allowed such observations to pass through, likely understanding that these messages would have a significant impact when read by families in Germany. The letters also reveal deeply personal reflections and inner conflicts. Some men admitted to confusion, beginning to question whether they had been systematically misled by propaganda from their own government. A Bavarian farmhand who had been captured in Tunisia wrote that they had been told Americans were criminals and savages, yet the guards spoke kindly to them, and it was difficult to understand how this could be. Another letter, preserved in a family archive in Württemberg, described how prisoners were permitted to attend church services in town under guard supervision, an experience the writer characterized as the most humane treatment he had ever witnessed as a prisoner. Of course, not every letter painted an entirely positive picture of captivity. Some prisoners expressed feelings of boredom, isolation, or deep frustration at the prolonged separation from loved ones. Others hinted at resentment, noting that their labour was being used to directly support the enemy's economic output. Still, the dominant emotional tone across these preserved letters was one of surprise at the level of trust demonstrated during their supervised excursions outside the camps. The simple absence of physical chains seemed to symbolize something larger to these men, representing a fundamental difference in ideological approach, a belief in maintaining order through confidence and systematic organization rather than through fear and force. After the war ended, many veterans recalled that writing about these experiences had been a way of psychologically processing what they were living through. Some had been cautious in their wording, knowing their letters would be scrutinized by censors, but others deliberately inserted subtle hints, suggesting that life in American captivity had begun to reshape their understanding of the world. Oral histories collected decades later often reference these wartime letters as representing the moment when prisoners first admitted, even to themselves, that America was fundamentally different from what they had been taught to believe. For their families receiving these letters back in Germany, the contents must have been profoundly bewildering. They were living under constant aerial bombardment, severe rationing of all basic goods, and strict censorship of information, while their sons and husbands wrote about towns where food was plentiful and guards trusted captives enough to let them walk in public without shackles. This stark contrast not only helped preserve morale among the imprisoned soldiers, but also planted seeds of doubt in the minds of family members who read these accounts. In this way, the written word became as powerful as the lived experience itself, carrying across the Atlantic Ocean a story of captivity that contradicted everything the propaganda machine had taught them to expect. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, German prisoners who had spent years detained in the United States faced the difficult process of returning to a homeland that lay in ruins. Large-scale repatriation operations began in 1946, with transport ships moving thousands of former captives from American camps back to Europe. Yet what these men carried with them went far beyond simple memories of confinement. They brought back lasting impressions of a society that had permitted them to walk without chains through its towns, to labour on its farms under minimal supervision, and to witness daily civilian life that appeared almost untouched by the massive destruction consuming their own country. Many of the returning soldiers found a Germany that was virtually unrecognisable from the nation they had left years earlier. Major cities like Hamburg, Cologne and Dresden existed mostly as ruins. Families everywhere struggled with critical shortages of food, housing, and the most basic necessities of life. Against this backdrop of devastation, the stories told by returning prisoners about their time in the United States sounded almost like fantasy. Some spoke of walking past shops filled with consumer goods, of being allowed to listen to American popular music, and of witnessing communities where families lived in relative peace and prosperity despite the ongoing global conflict. To their fellow Germans who had endured the full horror of the war at home, these accounts often seemed too incredible to be true. So vast was the gulf between German suffering and the American abundance the prisoners described. The memory of being trusted enough to walk without physical restraints remained central to how these former prisoners reflected on their experience. Many emphasized just how remarkable it had been to be escorted into towns without chains or handcuffs. For men who had been raised in a system where fear and violent coercion were routine tools of governance, the idea that authority could be effectively exercised without constant physical intimidation made a profound impression. Several post-war memoirs describe this realization as a genuine turning point in their understanding of how democratic systems could function, maintaining discipline not by chaining enemies, but by establishing clear expectations within a framework built on basic respect for human dignity. Historians who have studied this period note that exposure to American practices had subtle but genuinely lasting effects on post-war German society. Some former prisoners became teachers, community leaders, and business people who carried forward the lessons they had observed during their captivity. They drew conscious contrasts between American approaches to fairness and systematic organization versus the authoritarian structures of their past. Oral history projects conducted in the 1980s and 90s reveal that many of these men considered their years in the United States to have been formative experiences, fundamentally shaping their views about democracy and even influencing their support for West Germany's political and economic alignment with Western nations during the Cold War. These impressions also affected how the former prisoners remembered their American captors. Instead of harboring bitterness or resentment, many expressed genuine gratitude for having been treated according to international legal standards. The stories of supervised town visits, agricultural work details, and interactions with civilians were retold to children and grandchildren as examples of unexpected humanity emerging in the midst of global conflict. The absence of chains in those memories became symbolic of the wider contrasts they had experienced, differences between propaganda narratives and observable reality, between systems based on repression and those based on organized trust, between landscapes of destruction and communities of relative abundance. The transition back to German life was not without significant complications. Some former prisoners struggled to reconcile their positive experiences in America with the utter devastation they discovered upon returning home. For those who found themselves in Soviet-occupied zones of Germany, sharing stories about decent treatment by Western powers could actually be dangerous, as authorities in those regions were suspicious of men who might have been influenced by capitalist ideals. Other returning soldiers found that neighbours and family members, scarred by years of bombing raids and enormous losses, were not interested in hearing about humane treatment from the enemy. As a result, many suppressed their memories for decades, only speaking openly about their experiences much later in life when the immediate pain of the war years had faded. Despite these complications and challenges, the legacy of their captivity remained clear and powerful. The extraordinary historical fact that German soldiers, men who had been active combatants against the United States, had walked freely through American towns without physical restraints became a narrative that endured across multiple generations. It illustrated one of the profound paradoxes of the Second World War, that even in the midst of history's most bitter and destructive conflict, there existed moments of basic humanity that defied all expectations and played a meaningful role in shaping the course of post-war reconciliation and understanding between former enemies.